Welcome back. Previously in this course, we created reusable components for two very important HTML inputs, the base select and the base input, for select elements and input elements respectively. In this lesson, we will take on the challenge of creating a reusable component for checkbox inputs. Our goals remain the same. Our component should be highly reusable with a label property that can be bound, and they should be able to accept a two-way model binding through vModeling. Let's dive right in. First, we'll create a new file, basecheckbox.view, inside the components folder. We are going to add a template block and copy the input with type checkbox in our simpleform.view file, which holds the control for the catering into it. As we've done in our other components, we're going to tackle the label first. We need to make sure that we have a way to inject a label into this component. So we're going to add a label prop so that the parent can pass it down to our component. It will be of type of string and a default of an empty string. Now that we have our label property set, let's go to the label element and bind it using interpolation, and also make sure that we have a BF checking if the label exists. There's no real reason to render an empty label tag, and worse, we don't want to label it as an empty string. There are several accessibility considerations when talking about labels and inputs, and what we've been doing so far is not really accessible. However, in a later lesson, we will come back to all of these components and revisit accessibility in a separate lesson. Let's revisit our to-dos. The label property is added and bound. Next, let's talk about vModel binding. Checkbox have a few quirks that we need to keep in mind before we start setting up our bindings. The first one is that checkbox inputs bind their state to a checked property and not directly to value. The property value of checkboxes is not usually used on the front end, since its main purpose is to provide a value when submitted to the backend via a submit button. If omitted, this value defaults to on, which is fine for most apps, since most forms will be handled via some asynchronous posting and the passed variables to the backend are controlled by the front-end code. The second thing we need to keep in mind is that inputs with type checkbox don't trigger input events, but change events whenever they are selected and unselected. Now that we are armed with this knowledge, let's add the first part of our vModel contract, the model value prop. It will allow the parent to inject its state into the checkbox component. Let's go into the props object and add the model value prop. It will be of type boolean and the default will be of false. Now, let's go into the template and replace the vModel binding that was copy-pasted from the demo form earlier with our new checked binding into our model value property. Finally, we need to emit update model value whenever we want to alert the parent that the checkbox has been toggled. We will listen to the change event on the input element and emit the new checked state of our element whenever it fires. Notice that for checkboxes, we are not emitting the target's value through event target value, but instead the checked status through event target checked. Now that our component is ready, we can go back to simple form and replace both the catering and live music checkboxes with our brand new base checkbox component. We will start with the catering checkbox. Let's add a base checkbox instance with a vModel of event extras catering. Next, we will add the label property equal to catering. Let's do this one more time for the live music. We will add a base checkbox instance, add a vModel binding to event extras music, and finally add the label property equal to live music. Let's head over to our browser and toggle the checkboxes on and off to make sure the bindings are working. It looks like both the catering and live music checkboxes are working. As you can see below, the vModel binding correctly switches from true to false whenever I click them. Checkboxes have a few quirks that we had to learn in order to create our base checkbox component. In our next lesson, we're going to create our last component, the base radio for radio buttons. We will take a look at what makes them special and sometimes hard to deal with. See you there.